We're going to start this story in a forgotten corner of the fishing port at Shidao, China, where the rust-stained hull of a Squid fishing vessel sits abandoned. This decaying monument is the infamous Lurongyu 2682. When this ship left port for the distant fishing coasts of South America, it carried 33 men. When it returned to port 8 months later, only 11 were still on board. But this isn't a story about the dangers of the sea. This is a story of sociological horror unleashed in a drifting chamber of terror where brutality held command, and the horrifying realization that when you strip away the laws of society and isolate men within the terrifying, endless abyss of the Black Ocean, the comfortable illusion of human decency shatters. What remains is a descent into a floating slaughterhouse, where the only recognized authority was violence, and the only currency for survival was complicity in mass murder. The nightmare of the Lurongyu 2682 began before the ship even left port. In November of 2010, the trawler was anchored in the harbor near Jiku Pier, taking on supplies for a long, arduous 2-year expedition. Things got off to a pretty rough start right away. The ship's original cook, an experienced crewman named Yan, suffered what appeared to be a sudden and severe psychological breakdown. Shortly after 8 that night, the crew was startled by his crazed screams. "Murder! Murder!" he yelled as he ran frantically around the ship. He continued this hysterical screaming for hours, putting the entire crew on edge. Eventually, the ship's captain was able to calm him down. But just moments later, Yan ran across the deck and leaped into the freezing waters of the harbor below. Fortunately, he was rescued by a nearby boat. The seafood company that owned and operated the Lurongyu dismissed the incident. They claimed Yan suffered from a nervous disposition and quickly found a replacement. To the men watching from the deck, Yan's hysterical escape seemed like a tragedy. But as the ship idled in the black water, it became terrifyingly clear that Yan wasn't simply stressed out about the voyage. He may have just been trying to escape this floating slaughterhouse before the doors were locked. It was about a month later, on December 27, 2010, that the Lurongyu 2682 finally departed the eastern coast of China. Barely 10 minutes into the trip, the ship idled in the open water as a small motorboat raced to intercept them. Suddenly, dozens of unlicensed workers climbed on board. These were men who lacked the proper seafarer's certificates to work as crew on the ship. And while they may not have had experience, they were cheap. The seafood company loaded the men in open water to avoid custom inspectors looking too closely at the crewmen. Among these workers was a seemingly quiet, scrawny guy named Liu Guiduo. Liu also dragged aboard 165 cartons of cigarettes, purchased entirely on credit, to sell to the crew. The crew of 33 was a volatile group, hailing from various regions across China. Some were decent, hard-working men like Duan Jifeng, a former roadside barbecue vendor who was hoping to earn enough to start a family. Some were less so, such as ex-convict Qiang Lishan, who'd already served 2 stints in a labor camp for robbery. But arguably, the worst of them was the captain himself, Li Chengquan, a massive, quick-tempered man who maintained discipline with his fists. For the first 6 weeks, the vast scale and endless monotony of the Pacific Ocean kept the men quiet. But by late February of 2011, the vessel arrived in the waters off Peru, and the illusion of a standard commercial fishing expedition transformed into agonizing labor. Squid jigging is a sensory nightmare. In the pitch blackness, the crew turns on massive 2-kilowatt Philips lamps, suspending them from heavy poles over the water. The light was so intensely blinding that it made the men's eyes constantly stream with tears. It generated this almost unnatural, stadium-bright glare that lured squid from the depths to the surface. Leaning over the rusted railings, the exhausted men lowered hooks 50 meters into the freezing water, manually hauling up the thrashing squid. The work was endless. The men spent days and nights without sleep, covered in freezing brine, ink, and slime. If a crew member collapsed from exhaustion, Captain Lee would show up on the deck and urge him to get back to work with a swift punch to the face. As the physical toll drove the men to exhaustion, a devastating rumor began to quietly circulate through the claustrophobic bunk rooms. The crew slowly realized they had been cheated. The fishing company was never going to pay them the guaranteed flat rate of 45,000 yuan, or approximately 6,500 US dollars. The job was strictly commission only. Their actual pay was a mere 4 cents per pound of squid caught. Calculating how much they were catching, then deducting what they were charged for meals, bunks, and equipment, and they were basically working for free. Staring up at the ceiling of his bunk, Liu Guiduo did the math. He realized he wouldn't even earn enough to cover the inflated cost of the cigarettes he had brought on board. To make matters worse, the crew discovered their contracts had been stamped with a fake corporate seal. They had no legal rights, no valid paperwork, and no way off the boat. They were effectively a slave labor force consisting of illegal, unlicensed workers. Liu Guiduo went into a rage and immediately confronted Captain Lee, demanding to be sent home. The massive captain flatly refused. He laughed as he informed Liu that without a seaman license, no other fishing vessel would accept him. The trap had been sprung. The ship had become a lawless vacuum, suspended in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, thousands of miles from home, with a growing mass of angry men on board. The breaking point came 6 months into the trip, as the vessel drifted through Chilean waters. The air was freezing, the massive Phillips lamps extinguished for the night. Liu Guiduo approached the barbecue vendor, Duan Jifang, urging him to join a plot to hijack the ship. Jifang, paralyzed by the sheer gravity of the request, declined. Liu cursed under his breath and silently walked away. At 11 o'clock that night, the mutiny started. Operating with cold precision, Liu Guiduo and a small trusted core of accomplices shattered the ship's communications equipment and disabled the GPS. While a guard stood at the gangway ladder, gripping a knife in the dark, Liu Guiduo's faction stormed the captain's cabin. Armed with clubs and long, jagged squid knives, they beat Captain Lee, demanding he turn the ship back toward the Chinese mainland. The violent commotion echoed down into the bowels of the ship. The substitute cook grabbed a blade and rushed up the iron stairs to the bridge, screaming at the mutineers. He barely made it into the room. One of the mutineers intercepted the cook, driving a knife deep into his back. As the cook spun around to defend himself, an iron club swung from the shadows, crushing his left leg. The cook collapsed to the grated steel deck in agony. Standing over him, Liu Guiduo plunged the knife once into his chest and twice into his neck. As Liu stared at the lifeless body bleeding out onto the deck, he gave a simple order. The dead chef was dragged to the railing and discarded into the freezing, black Pacific Ocean. The violent mutineers then moved quickly to lock down the floating prison. They confiscated every squid knife on board and used steel bars to weld the lifeboats permanently shut to their davits, preventing any chance of escape. For the next 5 weeks, an eerie, terrifying calm infected the Lurongyu 2682. The crew, operating in a state of mass denial, agreed to a fabricated cover story. They would tell the authorities that the cook had simply slipped and fallen overboard into the sea. Problem solved, or so they thought. If the ship had smoothly navigated back to port, the nightmare might have ended there. But by July 20th, the trawler was traversing the incredibly isolated waters west of Hawaii, and the environment of total paranoia had begun to infect Liu Guiduo's mind. He knew his core group of mutineers was small, and he was completely surrounded by men who could regroup and retaliate at any moment. His suspicions worsened when the ship's fuel consumption oddly spiked. As the crew settled in for the night, one of Liu's informers whispered to him that the senior crew was intentionally sabotaging the vessel to slow their return to China, hoping it would trigger a rescue. Liu Guiduo didn't need any proof. He quickly realized the only way to stop their plan was to murder the entire ship's management in a bloody purge. Just past midnight, Liu Guiduo took the helm and cranked the ship's speaker system to its maximum volume, blasting upbeat, deafening pop music across the decks. The blaring music and the heavy vibration of the diesel engine served a singular, horrifying purpose. He was drowning out their screams. In the deafening noise, the mutineers slipped into the cabins. They descended upon the sleeping men, murdering them in their beds before dragging their bodies to the railings and throwing them overboard. The purge continued as they moved from room to room. Some crew members were called out into the dark corridor one by one. None returned. They were brutally stabbed and tossed into the sea. Moments later, the heavy metal door of a 12-berth cabin swung open. Two enforcers burst into the room, their clothes stained with fresh blood. They rushed the bunk of the second officer. The officer jolted awake just as the steel blades plunged into his chest. He fought back desperately, tumbling out of his bunk and crashing onto the cold floor, gasping for air. Liu Guiduo calmly stepped into the room. He looked down at the bleeding officer with a psychopathic detachment. "Hey, isn't that the second officer? Why are you lying on the floor?" Liu crouched down, casually driving his own squid knife into the man's torso. "I can see your guts leaking out," he whispered, before plunging the blade in again and again until the man stopped moving. The barbecue vendor who'd refused to join the mutiny lay completely paralyzed in a nearby bunk, holding his breath in the dark, watching the execution unfold. The purge continued until dawn. Liu Guiduo ordered his accomplices to march the captain's remaining loyalists to the starboard edge at knife point. When his own men hesitated to push the weeping sailors into the black abyss, Liu walked up, practically sighed, and stabbed the victims himself to demonstrate how easily it was done. By sunrise, 9 men had been killed and tossed overboard. A few days later, a university student quietly vanished in the night. It's believed he jumped overboard from pure terror, as the atmosphere of unmitigated horror spread throughout the ship like a virus. Liu chillingly told the terrified survivors that the student was his personal spy, deliberately cultivating the illusion that no one, nowhere, was safe from his wrath. The death toll now stood at 11. Out of the original 33, only 22 men remained alive, trapped in a floating slaughterhouse, where complicity and murder became the only way to survive. Sleeping in the captain's quarters under heavy armed guard, Liu Guiduo realized that returning to a Chinese port meant a guaranteed execution. He gathered the traumatized survivors and announced a new, desperate plan. They would sail for Japan and forge new identities. To fund this escape, Liu forced the remaining crew to use the ship's satellite phone to call their destitute families back home, demanding extortion money. It was a fatal miscalculation. The demand ignited a silent, burning rage among the surviving crew. A massive Mongolian enforcer named Bao De recognized that Liu Guiduo was slowly isolating anyone who wasn't part of his inner circle. Bao De quietly descended into the bottom deck sleeping quarters, organizing a strike to retake the ship. Seeking an advantage, he invited a 19-year-old crewman
and fellow Inner Mongolian into the counter-mutiny. The teenager agreed. And then he walked straight up to the bridge and betrayed the entire plot to Liu Guiduo.
Finding his faction heavily outnumbered, Liu resorted to a masterclass in sociopathic manipulation. He approached his captive, the ship's captain Li Chengquan. Liu fed the captain a poisonous lie, claiming that it was Bao De who had personally slaughtered the captain's friends. Liu essentially drafted the captain into his killing squad, informing him that the only way to survive the coming purge was to thoroughly soak his own hands in blood. When the sun set, Liu set a brutal trap. He armed one of his mutineers with a squid knife and sent him down into the belly of the ship to hide in the dark. Liu then went to find the Mongolian leader, Bao De, approaching him under the pretense of an alliance with the Mongolian faction. Speaking quietly over the roar of the engine, Liu claimed they needed to kill one of the mutineers who had betrayed the group. He asked the Mongolian to go down into the hold and drag the traitor up to the deck. The massive enforcer descended the iron stairs into the hold. He found the crewman cowering in the dark and dragged him back up towards the deck. The moment they emerged into the freezing air, the trap snapped shut. Captain Li lunged from the corner, attacking Bao De from the front, while another mutineer drove his blade deep into the Mongolian's back. Bao De collapsed onto the deck. He screamed down into the hold for his fellow Mongolians to rise up and save him. But the men below were completely paralyzed by the horror they were witnessing. No one came to help. Forced to name his co-conspirators as he laid there dying, Bao De was finally thrown over the railing into the ocean. Immediately, Liu Guiduo seized the ship's megaphone. His metallic, amplified voice echoed across the empty ocean, calling out the remaining Mongolians one by one. Each man was dragged from their bunks into the freezing air and marched to the railings at knife point. The terrified men hiding in the cabins below listened in silence to the horrifying rhythm of the purge. A scream, a dull thud, and the heavy splash of a body hitting the water. By sunrise, the entire Mongolian faction was wiped out. There were now only 16 men left alive. With the Mongolian faction entirely eradicated, the rest of the crew may have breathed a sigh of relief. But surviving the night didn't end this horror show. Instead, it brought a crushing, absolute certainty. The remaining men looked at the fresh blood pooled on the deck and realized the horrifying truth. Liu Guiduo was never going to leave witnesses. Obedience was no longer protection. They were all going to die. It was just a matter of when. For the ship's engineer, the anticipation of the blade was worse than the empty sea. At 4 o'clock the following morning, he made a desperate choice to end the nightmare for everyone. Without a word, he descended into the deepest, shadowed bowels of the vessel. He wrapped his hands around the heavy iron wheel of the primary sea valve and cranked it completely open. The Pacific Ocean immediately flooded the ship. Those crew members still left alive woke up to chaos. The ship pitched violently. While the crew momentarily forgot about their paranoia to man the water pumps, the engineer disappeared. He was never seen again. By the time the flooding was contained, the vessel's engines were basically shot, and to add to the problems, the floating slaughterhouse was now a sinking ship. Understanding the dire situation they were in, Liu Guiduo authorized the repair of the communications equipment and broadcast a desperate SOS. Knowing that rescue authorities would board the vessel within days, the 4 remaining senior deck officers saw a fleeting, desperate chance to survive this nightmare. Convinced that Liu would be coming for them next, they frantically lashed together loose wood and bunk frames to construct a crude raft. Strapping on bright orange life vests, they lowered themselves into the ocean.
Unfortunately, these men made a fatal mistake. Someone on the raft had deployed an umbrella anchor. The drag of the current caught the anchor, and instead of drifting away, the disabled hull of the Lurongyu slowly pulled the makeshift wooden raft right back to the bow.
Staring down from the deck, the treacherous Captain Li screamed, "Kill him!" The mutineers gathered hundreds of heavy, lead-weighted squid sinkers and hurled the iron projectiles down onto the men like artillery shells. The barrage knocked 3 of the men into the water, leaving only 1 left on the raft. One of the mutineers then grabbed a long metal harpoon and leaped down onto the raft, driving the spear into the man, sending him into the ocean. He, along with 2 of the other men, gradually drifted away. If the sharks didn't get them, their cheap life vests would be waterlogged and useless within hours. The one remaining crewman was found floating near the stern, treading water and frantically begging for his life.
Liu Guiduo stared down at him.
"Pull him in," he commanded. The mutineers hauled the poor man onto the rusted, blood-stained deck and watched as he lay there crying and shivering. It was at this exact moment that Captain Li turned to Liu Guiduo, pointing a massive finger at the barbecue vendor and the older ex-convict. The captain coldly pointed out that these 2 guys hadn't killed anyone yet. If the authorities were on their way, they couldn't be left as innocent witnesses. They needed blood on their hands.
The ex-convict, desperate to prove his loyalty, instantly lunged for a knife to execute the groveling man on the deck. But Liu Guiduo raised his hand, stopping him. "No, tie him up and throw him back in." The quiet barbecue vendor, who'd spent 8 months desperately shrinking into the background, faced his final test. Under the dead stare of Liu Guiduo, he, along with the ex-convict, pulled off the man's life vest and bound his wrists tightly behind his back. Taking heavy fishing line, they wrapped thick, lead squid sinkers around his waist. It took nearly 5 minutes for them to drag the weighted, bound crewman towards the back of the boat. With a final, agonizing push, they forced the last of the senior deck officers off the steel lip of the ship. The heavy lead sinkers flew out, instantly dragging the 22nd and final victim down into the depths of the ocean. Out of the original 33 men, only 11 were still alive.
Shortly after the final murder, the crippled Lurongyu 2682 was engulfed by the violent swells of Typhoon Muifa. With the engines dead, it drifted helplessly for a full week before Chinese fishing authorities finally established a tow line. As the ship was slowly dragged back to civilization, the remaining crew of 11 huddled together, frantically rehearsing their massive lie. They settled on a story about a rogue gang that had slaughtered the crew and escaped on a raft. They had their story, now all they had to do was sell it. On August 13th, 2011, the tow line finally dragged the rusted, blood-stained hull of the Lurongyu back to the docks of Shidao port. The 11 survivors walked down the gangway, tightly clutching their fabricated story. They expected a routine maritime debriefing, but the police were already waiting. The men were handcuffed, thrown into separate police cars, and subjected to relentless interrogation. The facade of loyalty instantly collapsed. The youngest mutineer, the 19-year-old Mongolian, was the first to break. He sobbed as he laid out the horrifying 8-month timeline of the mutiny. The barbecue vendor Duan Jifang soon followed. At the highly publicized trial, all 11 of the crew were convicted of their roles in the bloodbath. 6 men, including the leader of the mutiny, Liu Guiduo, the treacherous Captain Li Chengquan, and 4 others, were condemned to death.
Duan Jifeng, having traded his morality for his life, was handed a more lenient 4-year prison sentence. He accepted it without appeal, still haunted by the horror of what he'd done. Before the executions were carried out, Duan later retold a story of walking in heavy iron shackles down a prison corridor. He passed the cell of Liu Guiduo. Liu was heavily restrained to his bed, having recently attempted yet another violent prison break. As Duan walked past, Liu slowly turned his head, locking eyes with the man he'd forced into murder, and raised his heavily shackled right hand, extending a single finger. Slowly, deliberately, Liu mimicked pulling a trigger and smiled.
When a man desperate for work finds himself in a factory or on a fishing boat or in a field, working, toiling for little or no pay and beaten if he tries to escape, that is slavery.